In the age of mass incarceration, for-profit prisons have been marketed as a cheap solution to prison overcrowding. They exist in the US for profit, yes, but they wouldn't exist without the foundations of slavery, convict leasing, prison plantations, the war on drugs, and the war on terror. This is the story of private, for-profit prisons in America. It's a doozy, whatever the hell that means.
A hidden, intricate web links hundreds of popular food brands to work done by U.S. prisoners.
Lighted by the crystal chandeliers above.
Prisoners can sometimes be punished for refusing to work.
Private prisons, generally, have been around for a long time in various forms, but the modern corporate, for-profit prison industrial complex has its roots in the United States. It began with the end of the Civil War and the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865, which abolished slavery with one exception, that it could be used as punishment for a crime. With the abolishment of chattel slavery and 4 million slaves freed, there was a massive labor shortage in the South, and the economy was decimated. Many slave plantations transitioned to sharecropping systems, where former slaves, and some poor white people as well, became tenants on land owned by former slave owners in exchange for about half of the crop produced. The sharecropping system had serious issues.
They come here with one thought in mind, is to survive till the end of this season and save enough money to get to the next state.
The sharecropper had to pay for the seeds. The sharecropper had to pay for the fertilizer. The sharecropper had to pay for the maintenance of the tractors. It had to pay for the gas. It had to pay for the fuel. It had to pay for the feed for the horses and the mules. And yet, when the crop was gathered, the sharecropper gathered it all. And then the owner took half of that.
Debt could accumulate quickly and carry over into future years, and laws forbade tenants from selling their crops to anyone but their landlord. As a result, tenant farmers almost never made a profit, were trapped in a cycle of endless debt, and entirely beholden to landowners. Even so, free workers were considerably less productive than slaves. In the antebellum South, slaves produced 75% more cotton per hour than free workers, because slaves were brutally tortured if they didn't produce enough.
Now, this is a replica of a slave collar. This was put on a person to keep them from getting into the woods.
At the same time, immediately after abolition, white businesses and landowners pressured state and local governments to pass new laws called black codes. These laws allowed for the arrest and imprisonment of only black Americans for a broad variety of reasons, including homelessness, owning property, owning weapons, owning livestock, gambling, interracial sex, initiating conversation with a white woman, speaking too loudly to a white woman, being employed by someone who wasn't their former slave owner, being unemployed, being employed by a non-white person, changing employers without permission from their former owner, selling cotton after sunset, trying to vote, running for elected office, serving on a jury, or testifying in court, and much, much more. For these crimes, former slaves would either be convicted and sent to prison, or could be required to pay a fine. If they couldn't pay that fine, any white person could pay the fine and take ownership of the person as a convict to lease. This led to the mass imprisonment of former slaves and not enough room to hold them in state prisons. This is how for-profit prisons were born, or a proto-version of them at least, with the practice of convict leasing, where states would rent prisoners, the majority of whom were former slaves, to private companies and individuals, the majority of whom were former slave owners, for work in coal mines, lumber camps, railroad companies, textile mills, farms, and especially cotton plantations that previously used slave labor. The prisoners would live on site, under complete control of the people renting them. They worked up to 18 hours per day without pay, and were far more productive than non-prisoner workers because, like slaves, they faced brutal torture as punishment for not producing enough. Torture that was, in fact, identical to the methods used against slaves, like watering, where a prisoner was tied down and water poured down their throat through a funnel until they felt like they were going to die, or stringing up, being hung from a tree by their thumbs for hours at a time. Flogging and whipping were common practice. Again, most of these people were in prison for things like talking to a white woman. First it's selling cotton after sunset, next it's anarchy. Convict renters were also incentivized to work their prisoners to literal death, especially if their sentences were short. Unlike slave owners, these renters didn't have to purchase a new slave if one died. They could simply rent a new one from the state without any repercussions. The average death rate was 16 to 25% of prisoners each year, and could go up to 40% in some locations. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's got to be tough on morale. Well, the good news was, if you were a post-slavery slaver, I guess, that if the supply of black prisoners ran low, there would suddenly be a wave of new arrests for violations of black codes. Suddenly there are a lot of black people around here whistling on Tuesdays. The judges overseeing these cases were often directly in the employ of private companies who benefited. In addition, convict renters started buying, selling, and trading convicts amongst one another for profit. Essentially, convict leasing was created as a way to continue slavery under another name, and the southern states shifted from a slave-based economy to a convict leasing-based economy. They were not coy about this. They did not try to hide their motivations. The emancipation of the slaves was overwhelmingly seen by the Confederate states as morally evil and an affront to the natural, divine order that must be rectified. Around the same time as abolition, the Telegraph and Texas Register published an article asking, if a profit of several $1,000s can be made on the labor of 20 slaves, why may not a similar profit be made on the labor of 20 convicts?
But here, it's interesting to point out to the ages that we mentioned before in the cemetery, that the average age of the enslaved workers in the fields was between 10 and 16 years old.
Just 5 years after the abolition of slavery, Southern prisons had gone from about 5% to 95% black, and up to 90% of all prisoners were former slaves. Many former plantation owners and Confederate Army officers found new work as convict renters. Nathan Bedford Forrest, a wealthy slaver, general of the Confederate Army, and Grand Wizard of the KKK, ran all convict leasing plantations in Mississippi after the war. General John B. Gordon, another traitor, helped create Georgia's convict leasing system and leased hundreds of prisoners to work in his own coal mines. He would later become governor of Georgia and a U.S. senator, and was a suspected member of the KKK. Major John T. Milner was a Confederate engineer who went on to lease convicts for mining and railroad operations, and is quoted as saying that black men must be made a slave again under the name of a convict. Captain James W. English relied almost entirely on convict leasing for his brick manufacturing company, where hundreds of black men died. He later became the mayor of Atlanta. Some former slavers, through convict leasing, ended up even wealthier than they had been during slavery. Yes, the best time to be a wealthy slave owner in the South was after the Confederacy was defeated.
This is Florida.
These are citizens of the United States, 1960. This is the way the humans who harvest the food for the best-fed people in the world get hired. One farmer looked at this and said, "We used to own our slaves. Now we just rent them."
Aileen King, I saw your children yesterday at the Okeechobee camp. Why didn't you put them in the nursery?
I don't make enough to pay for it.
How much does it cost to put them in?
85 cents.
6 this morning to 4 o'clock this afternoon.
That's right.
How much did you earn?
$1.
$1?
That's right. $1.
Is that because the beans were of poor quality?
That's right.
Has this happened before?
That's right.
How much will your food cost you today?
About $2.
This continued for almost 50 years before convict leasing was gradually banned, state by state, beginning around 1900 thanks to the work of black activists and the labor movement. Alabama was the last state to end the practice in 1928. But that was not the end of forced labor for prisoners. Some states began replacing convict leasing with chain gangs, prisoners who lived in state prisons and were transported outside to perform labor for the state. So, rather than the state renting prisoners to private entities, the states themselves would put the prisoners to work.
Don't look at the camera, boy. Look over that way, will you? That's for you, I mean. That's right.
I haven't had a man in solitary confinement in 5 months.
And 3 in shackles.
And only 3 in shackles, and that was for a escape.
So much money had been made from convict leasing by private companies and individuals that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, states themselves began buying up former slave plantations and turning them into prison plantations. Rather than renting out prisoners to private companies, the states themselves reaped the profits of prison labor, and the same forms of torture were used. When convict leasing was abolished in Texas in 1910, the state bought 140,000 acres of plantations and converted them into state prisons. Fun fact, all prisons in Texas built prior to 1980 were former slave plantations. Fun. One of them was the Ramsey Prison Farm. By the 1960s, it was the size of Manhattan, with 1,500 prisoners working fields of cotton and grain, earning substantial revenue for the state of Texas. It was a segregated, black-only prison until 1963, but the majority of its prisoners remained black after desegregation. In 1967, a former pastor named Terrell Don Hutto became the warden of Ramsey Prison Farm, where he lived in a plantation house and had his own houseboy, a black prisoner who worked in the house as his personal servant. At Ramsey, Hutto learned how to operate prisons for profit for the state by cutting corners wherever possible, like saving money on guards by using armed prisoners to manage and punish, using torture, the rest of the population.
The man's assistants put it on my neck, and I instantly realized that I could not go on my journey wearing this thing. The reason being, if I tripped and fell, the prongs would hit the ground first, and my neck would break.
In 1971, the same year President Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number 1, Terrell Don Hutto left his position as warden of Ramsey Prison Farm and became director of the Arkansas Department of Corrections until 1976, and then deputy director of the Virginia Department of Corrections until 1980. This is the next major turning point in the story of for-profit prisons. In the 1980s, with deindustrialization in the US, unemployment was soaring, inflation was rampant, there was significant economic uncertainty, and the country was deep in recession. There is a robust, well-known connection between these factors and increased risk for drug abuse in the population, and that's exactly what happened. Drug abuse soared, as did panic over the crack epidemic, and there was renewed support for Nixon's war on drugs. The public wanted to put more people in prison for doing drugs, but didn't want to pay more taxes to build the new jails that would be required to hold them. President Reagan, with his strong ideological bent toward privatization, offered the perfect opportunity for an enterprising new business model.
I found it pretty easy to come in, coming from the military. Corrections does have somewhat of a military structure.
With the backing of 17,000 employees, we combine the accountability of government with the efficiency of business.
In 1983, Hutto started a company, Corrections Corporation of America, or CCA, the nation's first for-profit prison company. He had two business partners, Thomas Beasley, the chairman of the Tennessee Republican Party, and Robert Krantz, the CFO of a real estate company in Nashville. Beasley would tell a reporter of his new business venture, "You just sell it like you were selling cars or real estate or hamburgers." The company received its first federal contract in 1983 from the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which gave them only 90 days to construct a new immigrant detention facility in Texas. CCA fulfilled the contract, technically, by leasing a motel in Houston, promising to hire all of the owner's family members and putting up a barbed wire fence as a perimeter wall. Then, the company built its first modern prison in 1984 in Tennessee. This was the first time the US government had contracted out the entire operation of a prison to a private company. Competition emerged almost immediately, with several prison companies founded in the 1980s, but the most important was Wackenut Corrections Corporation, founded in 1984 by businessman Georg Zoley as a division of the Wackenut Corporation, an existing security company.
The GEO Group is the leader in providing diversified services to government agencies around the globe. Our global expertise in outsourcing includes the design, construction, financing, management, and operation of jails, prisons, and special purpose institutions, and immigration and detention centers.
In 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was signed into law by President Reagan, and harsher punishments were instituted for drug possession, including a mandatory minimum sentence for crack cocaine that was 100 times higher than for possession of the same amount of powder cocaine. There was a massive influx of new, mostly black prisoners, leading to severely overcrowded prisons and skyrocketing costs to run them. So the for-profit prison companies pitched their solution. Instead of spending money all at once to build new prisons, pay us money annually to rent out facilities that we build ourselves. It was pitched as a temporary solution to the problem, just a stopgap measure until new prisons could be built. Instead, it became a permanent part of the US system. Corrections Corporation of America went public the same year the Anti-Drug Abuse Act went into effect, with an initial public offering of $18 million, about $50 million in today's money. And Wall Street started buying and selling stock that increased based on how many people went to prison. CCA soon expanded rapidly, with prisons for adults, children, and immigrants opening across the country over the next few years. Hutto, the founder of CCA, became president of the American Correctional Association, the trade group for the prison industry, which soon came out in favor of for-profit prisons under his leadership. Over the next 2 decades, the US prison population exploded, and the majority of the increase was for non-violent offenses. 1.5 million new prisoners were added to the system just from the war on drugs, and black men were vastly overrepresented compared to their rates of drug use. The 90s saw its own crime panics, like the highly anticipated and racist black juvenile violent crime wave that never happened.
They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel.
While crime dropped dramatically in the mid-90s to the 2000s, the prison population continued increasing. CCA and Wackenhut continued expanding, building new facilities in addition to buying up smaller prison companies across the US, consolidating power until the two companies dominated the market. Wackenhut changed its name to Geo Group in 2003, and CCA changed its name to CoreCivic in 2016. Today, these two companies control 75% of the for-profit prison industry in America, with annual revenues of about $2 billion each. In the end, the war on drugs was an abject failure in terms of stopping drug abuse, but it did succeed in making a small group of people extraordinarily wealthy. And the effects of the war on drugs are still felt today. About 250,000 Americans go to jail each year for drug crimes, and 26% of all arrests in the United States are for drug use. Marijuana alone accounts for 11% of all arrests nationwide. While for-profit prisons were born out of convict leasing in the post-Civil War period, it was the war on drugs that made for-profit prisons into an industry proper. Of course. Of course. And of course, with their newfound wealth and influence, the companies were able to lobby for their interests. From 1989 to 2015, Geo Group and Corrections Corporation of America spent about $35 million on lobbying and campaign contributions that we know about, with no accounting for dark money. Over the same time period, incarceration rates increased by 1,600%. They've primarily lobbied for longer sentences, mandatory minimum sentences, and tough-on-crime policies, and against the legalization of cannabis and legislation that would increase oversight in the industry. And like most big corporations, they're prolific users of the revolving door of lobbyists and lawmakers. Pam Bondi, the current Attorney General of the United States. Maybe you've heard of her. How's the Dow doing? She used to be a lobbyist for Geo Group. Today, immigration detention is the most profitable sector, with increasing privatization beginning after 9/11. With the war on terror and the US drowning in fear over dangerous foreigners, the Homeland Security Act abolished the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and its functions were relegated to the new Department of Homeland Security, which split the former responsibilities of INS between three new agencies: U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, or ICE. And ICE detention facilities became the new cash cow for the for-profit prison industry. In 2001, of the 20,000 people who were held at any one time in immigration facilities, about 10% of them were held in for-profit facilities. In 2009, when Obama took office, it was about 49%. As Obama prepared to leave office in 2016, it was about 60%. That same year, the Obama administration announced plans to phase out the use of private prisons in the federal system, and the industry reacted with a wave of increased lobbying to counteract these efforts, while continuing their expansion into immigration detention.
CBS News has learned 2 of the 3 major private prison companies here in the U.S. donated $500,000 combined to President Trump's inauguration committee. But Jamie, the U.S. Department of Justice says this decision is all about giving prison officials the flexibility they need to manage their facilities properly.
When Trump came to office in 2017, his administration immediately reversed course on plans to reduce the use of for-profit prisons and began seeking bids from private companies for new facilities. Within a month, Geo Group received a new $110 million contract, and so for-profit immigrant detention continued to expand. By the end of Trump's first term, the amount of detainees in for-profit detention centers went from 60 to 80%. When Biden came to office in 2021, he issued an executive order to stop using for-profit companies altogether in the federal prison system. But the order said nothing about immigration detention centers, and the industry immediately went to work putting even more focus on this sector. Geo Group, for example, reopened a private jail that had been closed, the Moshannon Valley Processing Center in Pennsylvania, and turned it into a detention center. It is now the largest facility in the Northeast, earning the company about $3.4 million per month from this single facility. Other companies followed suit, and within 3 years of the Biden administration, the percent of immigrant detainees in for-profit detention centers increased from 80 to 90%. But shareholders and investors in the for-profit industry were still miffed about being excluded from the federal prison system. In the 2024 election cycle, with Trump bloviating about mass deportations and getting tough on crime, the industry donated over $1 million to his re-election campaign. Again, that we know of. Within days of the 2024 election, stock in CoreCivic increased by 29%, and stock in Geo Group increased by 41%. And the industry's investments in Trump are paying off, with the administration's policies leading to a windfall of public cash for these companies, especially CoreCivic and Geo Group, their primary contractors. With the passing of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act in January 2025, ICE's detention operating budget quadrupled, adding more than $11 billion a year, making it the biggest federal agency in the nation, with an additional $45 billion appropriated for new detention centers, not for building new detention centers, but for contracts with the for-profit industry, triggering a gold rush in the sector, especially for CoreCivic and Geo Group. In a 2025 earnings call for CoreCivic and Geo Group, executives were absolutely salivating over the new influx of revenue. Georg, executive chairman for Geo Group, told investors,
"All of these efforts are aimed at placing our company in the best competitive position possible to pursue what we continue to believe are unprecedented growth opportunities."
Especially with Stephen Miller's announcement that the administration had a quota of 3,000 ICE arrests per day, with a need for 100,000 new beds by the end of the year. The Justice Department later denied the existence of a quota, but based on the earnings calls, industry executives treated it as fact. Damon Henninger, CEO of CoreCivic, told investors,
"I've worked at CoreCivic for 32 years, and this is truly one of the most exciting periods in my career with the company.
Our business is perfectly aligned with the demands of this moment. We are in an unprecedented environment with rapid increases in federal detention populations nationwide and a continuing need for solutions we provide."
Line go up. Oh, this just in. Bandage manufacturers thrilled with increase in knife crime. But you may wonder why these companies are so excited about immigration detention. Aren't the immigrants just temporarily in these facilities while awaiting court and deportation? Well, the ICE contracts include provisions to ensure their profitability. In some cases, ICE pays for the total number of beds available in a facility regardless of whether they are full, which increases their incentive to keep them full so money isn't wasted on paper. In other cases, contracts stipulate that a minimum number of beds must be occupied at all times, often at least 90%. In addition, the administration instituted a new policy banning immigration judges from releasing detainees who are waiting for their court dates in the severely backlogged system. As a result, many detainees are being kept for months, and some are being held for a year or more. there have been increasing reports of immigrants who have agreed to being deported but are being kept in detainment anyway. Some US citizens and legal immigrants have been picked up and detained too, and even though they'll end up getting released, the companies still get paid for holding them.
We reported his arrest outside his tow shop. He says agents came in but never showed him a warrant.
One of them literally just tells him, hey, just get him, he's Mexican.
A terrified woman flees two men in masks.
Leave me alone!
It's not a mugging. She's an American citizen being chased by ICE agents who think she's here illegally.
Yeah, the same agent that sprayed pepper spray into the vent of my car. When I got into the car, the three ICE agents immediately started mocking and taunting me. One took a picture of me and showed the other ones laughing. And then, yes, that one agent said, you guys got to stop obstructing us. That's why that lesbian is dead.
I got rights to talk, bro.
You got no right here.
I do.
Illegal, brother.
You're starting to resist more now.
We're going to end up.
In short, these companies, in tandem with the administration, are keeping as many beds full as possible for as long as possible at the expense of the taxpayer. At the 2025 Border Security Expo, were you there? I didn't see you there. I spent most of my time in the man-trap section. Border Czar Tom Homan was in attendance and made clear in his keynote speech that Trump's plans for mass deportation were relying on the private sector, saying, we need to buy more beds, we need more airplane flights, and I know a lot of you are here for that reason. Let the badge and gun do the badge and gun stuff. Everything else, let's contract out. ICE Director Todd Lyons was there and told the crowd, we need to get better at treating this like a business, like Amazon Prime, but with human beings.
Last year, you said in Phoenix at the Border Security Expo that you wanted to see a deportation process that was like, quote, Amazon Prime, but with human beings. Mr. Lyons, how many times has Amazon Prime shot a mom 3 times in the face?
None, sir.
And how did things go for the industry in 2025? Well, ICE detentions are the highest they've ever been since the agency's creation. The number of beds has increased from 39,000 in 2024 to 70,000 in 2025. Geo Group, the #1 ICE contractor, saw its profits increase from $32 million in 2024 to $254 million in 2025. In a February earnings call with investors, Zoli said it was the most successful year for new business wins in our company's history, and laid out plans to start converting commercial warehouses into detention centers. CoreCivic's profits increased from $70 million in 2024 to $116 million in 2025, and yet, in an earnings call with investors on the same day as Geo Group, there were complaints that it wasn't enough, with one investor saying, one of the big questions has been the pace of detention by ICE, that it's been below what investors thought it was going to be. I think people thought we'd be at 100,000 level. We're at a little over 70,000. But CEO Patrick Swindle, real name, reassured investors saying, ICE was our first customer 43 years ago and has been our largest customer for over a decade, and said that 2026 was expected to be even more profitable. He went on to say that the company had informed ICE they could provide it with nearly 13,000 additional beds, and this does not include additional capacity we may be able to provide through other means. Other means? Other means? Ding dong. Hello, ICE. Hello. Could you look after these people? The industry was born out of slavery, became a full-on industry in the war on drugs, got even bigger from the war on terror, and then from immigration detention. Contributing to this, public fear, leading to mass incarceration and overcrowding prisons, in turn leading to massive profits for a select few. There's a theme here, isn't there?
All right.
In part 2, I'll be talking about how for-profit prisons actually work, the privatization of prison-adjacent services, and if any of these things are actually cheaper to operate. Can you guess? Badly, myriad and corrupt, and no. But watch it anyway, it'll be a right laugh. Thanks for watching. See you next time, hopefully. You can watch these videos about a week early on Patreon, so bung me some dollary doos, megacents, rand, whatever the hell it is in your country, bananas, digitize them first. Appreciate it, and if you don't, I appreciate it anyway. If you like and subscribe, yada yada, may God have mercy on us all.